Well, hello and welcome to our Christ Baptist Church devotional as we're making our way through the book of Genesis. We've gone through many books of the Bible and now we're in Genesis, a long one, 50 chapters. We're going to see what we can do. We've gone through Genesis 1 all the way to Genesis chapter 8. And we covered the flood, Genesis 6 to 8, and covered the whole idea of the flood and what God's purpose was in the flood. And it really, as we dug into the verses and dug into the actual explanation there, we found that God is actually, as a means of grace, wiped out Satan's attack on the human race. And that was the whole point of the flood in doing that. And yes, sinful men were there and they all got wiped out, but we also see there's sinful men in the boat as well that came out. And we're just now going to see coming out what happens now with God as a God of grace and living and working with sinful men as he works out his plan with the 8 simple men and women who came out of the boat. But God is pleased because he has purged the danger to his seed, Jesus Christ, in the flood or through the flood. And now we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 9. We're going to take a look at this and see the first covenant in the Bible, the idea of covenant, which is something that God makes a promise, and it's one-sided, meaning there's nothing Noah had to do to affirm the covenant. This is only God himself doing a one-sided covenant, meaning I promise to do this no matter what. This is a covenant of grace that God gave. And we're going to see this right here in Genesis chapter 9. Let's just start with Genesis 9 verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So as soon as they come off the boat, God tells Noah and his family, now, we want to see you have lots of children, big families. Verse 2, now that he's got a boat full of animals, they all come off the ark, Noah's certainly outnumbered. There's a lot more bears and lions and dogs and crocodiles and all kinds of things like that coming out. He says in verse 2, the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky, with everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea into your hand they are given. What this tells us is, before the flood, animals were not afraid of people, and they were not a threat to the people. People were not afraid of animals. Animals weren't going to attack them. Everything was just coexisting. But here now, God says the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth. And that's where we get this natural fear of man that all the animal kingdom has. They're not afraid when other animals walk by. If you ever go in the bush and you see certain animals, they come close to each other, they walk by each other, and everything seems to be fine. They're getting along. It's like they talk the same language, but get a person anywhere nearby, and man, they are very concerned. And that's where we get it, right here. Everything goes away from people. Well, we understand, verse 3, it's why every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you, as I gave the green plant. They see man as the biggest predator. Man is just a machine that turns animals into food. And they know that now by instinct all over. But he says, just as I gave the green plant, which means in the garden, all the way up to this point, all people were vegetarians. They ate nothing but plants. But now he says, every moving thing that is alive I shall give for food to you. He now opens it up and says, I now want you to eat the animals, eat meat. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely I'll require your lifeblood. From every beast I'll require it. From every man's brother I'll require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. You see, you just don't eat the blood because life is in the blood. You don't eat something when it's living. Life is sacred. Now when it's killed and it's done, it's dead, and the blood's drained, now you eat it. It's meat. It's done. It's gone. But not while things are still alive. And he gives the rule of capital punishment. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. This is capital punishment. When you kill somebody, then the penalty is death. That's what God says. For in the image of God he made man. But now as for you, verse 7, he says, as for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him. Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. So it's not just with Noah and his sons and their wives and everybody else who comes after. Everybody. and with every living creature that's with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. So all life has this covenant that God makes with all life. He says from 11 to 16, actually verse 17, he says, I will establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by water of the flood, neither shall there again be flood to destroy the earth. You know what this says? All the people in the last 100 years have been worried about global warming, climate change, and the fact that the seas are going to rise and we're going to be flooded. What does God say? Never again will I flood the earth. Never. It's not going to happen. The earth's going to burn up. It's not going to be flooded. There's never going to be that. Oh, the tides will rise here and there, and some floodplains will go up in here and there. And yeah, some erosion happens. Sure, that's all natural. But we're not going to be flooded out because of climate change or anything like that. God's promise stands with that. God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. It shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I'll remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature on all flesh that's on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all the flesh that's on the earth. The rainbow. When the water comes out of the clouds and the sun is going through the light, is going through the rain, and it hits all those colors of the spectrum of colors, that is a sign that happened that didn't happen until then. Couldn't have happened until then, because this alone is the sign of God's covenant with all living things on the earth, even to us today. Whenever there's a rainbow, that's a sign that just says God's never going to flood the earth again, ever. There's a covenant. He'll never flood the earth again. As long as we see rainbows in the storm and after a storm, we know God is never going to judge the earth again and kill all life because it needs to be purified. It's not going to happen. That's a covenant that also reminds us what's special about the flood. The fact that there was grace in the flood. The fact that there was Noah who found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And he was in the boat with his children. And they received grace, protection, sealed by the atonement, carrying the seed of Christ, protected from God's wrath. That's what this rainbow shows, is a promise that Noah was protected by God's wrath at that historical event, and that God will never flood the earth again. But we can always use it to think of what happened when God put Noah in the boat and secured them from his wrath. That's what a rainbow shows, is that God's grace is very active on the earth today. Very active on the earth today. It's like when you see a rainbow, God's grace is active still. Still available, still active. Through this first covenant. There wasn't a covenant with Adam. There wasn't a covenant beforehand. This is the first covenant right here in the Bible that tells us. So we see that a rainbow, something is a natural phenomenon that always happens, is a sign that God will never flood the earth again. But it's also a reminder that God's grace is still active, because it's a promise. And it began with God's grace in the boat for Noah. Well, verse 18 tells us now that sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. Three of them, Shem, Ham, Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. This is the first time, again, we see the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But initially we talk about Ham as the father of Canaan, but we have no other words about Japheth's kids or Shem's kids. And we know that Shem actually carried the seed. We know that Shem is where Abraham came from, and Isaac and Jacob all came from Shem. Why doesn't Shem get promise here? Or why did he get priority here? No, it's Ham. Do you see that? Ham was the father of Canaan. That just comes out of nowhere. He wants us to know this. Verse 19, a very important verse. I'd highlight this verse. From these three were the sons of Noah. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. Very clear statement. Everybody on earth came from Shem, Ham, or Japheth, which means everybody came from Noah. Everybody came from Shem, Ham, or Japheth. Nobody came from anybody else. This verse, written really by God through the hand of Moses, tells us that you're either related to Shem, Ham, or Japheth, which means you're related to Noah. In verse 20, well, unfortunately, Noah got into some nonsense here. Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. Well, he obviously didn't take very good care because he let the vine and the grapes become a little fermented, and he drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Well, he's inside his tent. He's not outside. He's inside. He's inside the tent. But Ham, the father of Canaan, there it is again, the father of Canaan. Why do we care about this? The father of Canaan, the father of Canaan. He didn't even have Canaan yet. Father of Canaan saw the nakedness of his father, and he told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it upon both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away, so that they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah woke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So somehow he figured out Canaan embarrassed him, humiliated him a little bit. Shem and Japheth, they took care to make sure they covered their father respectfully. And we see this interesting curse comes from Noah. Noah, so he knows what his youngest son Ham had done. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the servant of servants. He shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. And let Canaan be a servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a servant." So he tells us that Canaan is going to be Shem's servant, Canaan's going to be Japheth's servant, and he'll be a servant of servant to his brothers. So it's kind of a curse that he'd said, "Cursed be Canaan." He's cursed. And he's cursed so much that he will actually serve. He'll be lower than Shem and lower than Japheth in all aspects. He's going to struggle. Now, where'd this come from? Well, it's interesting that Ham is the one who actually would have sinned against Noah, but Noah didn't curse Ham, he cursed Canaan. Why would he do that? Well, as we get later on, we see what was in the rest of the Bible, Genesis and Exodus, Numbers, especially when Moses led the Exodus out. Go into the land of Canaan and kill them all. Kill all of the Canaanites. And it's out of the land of Canaan that we see the Nephilim in Numbers 13, verse 33. The Nephilim were there, and also afterwards, Numbers 13:33, they were part of the Canaanites. The Canaanites were part of the Nephilim, part of the cursed ones, the fallen ones who needed to be purified from the earth. So the best understanding we can have, we don't have all the information. It's kind of like answering the question, where did Cain get a wife? We don't know. The best guess we have, it had to be his sisters and so forth, because that's how the earth was populated. And so where did the Nephilim come from? They had to come from one of these three sons, Shem, Ham, or Japheth. Why? Because we see that verse 19, from these three, all the earth was populated, including the Nephilim. So Canaan is where there was some corruption that still carried through the lines and needed to be purged, and was killed by Moses, killed by Joshua, killed by David. Well, Canaan is certainly a servant of servants here. He's under everybody. Verse 28, Noah lived 350 years after the flood, so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Just to put the exclamation point on that, just like Genesis chapter 5. Doesn't matter if you live 950 years, you're still going to die. You still must die, because you're not going to live forever and eat from the tree of life. We do not want to keep our life going on here because we want to die so we can get new life and be with the Lord. That is the whole point of kicking everybody out of the garden, so that they could eventually live a life dependent on God, and then die to have new life. And what we see out of Genesis 9 is the first covenant in the Bible, first covenant, where God made a covenant. He'll never destroy the earth. And what's the picture of that covenant? The rainbow's a sign, and it's a picture of God's continuing grace. Because out of that storm, out of that rain, out of that water, there was a boat with 8 people that were protected from God's wrath. So we see the ultimate depth of what's going on here in that first covenant and the rainbow. Protection from God's wrath by God who sealed the door. Whenever we look at a rainbow, we can say God's grace is still active. There is hope. He is not going to destroy the earth again. There is hope, and grace is active. And there's always hope for today. As long as we're still alive, there's hope. There's a rainbow. There's hope that God's grace will be active in my life today. And we can take that to the bank because there's a rainbow. And that's what we get out of Genesis chapter 9. We'll see you in the next devotion as we hit to Genesis chapter